Welcome to our sharing on St. John's Gospel. I want to continue to talk to you about John chapter 8 and this wonderful event where Jesus shows himself as the merciful judge in a situation that was brought to him that it seemed as if the Jewish leaders this time could bring him down. So I want to read some of the text and then we'll comment on it. The scribes and Pharisees brought a woman along who had been caught committing adultery. And making her stand there in full view of everybody, they said to Jesus, "Master, this woman was caught in the very act of committing adultery. And Moses ordered us in the law to condemn women like this to death by stoning. What have you to say?" This is very, very interesting, and we need to take it step by step because there's an awful lot here. Jesus is on trial, and the woman is on trial as well. So we were told back in verse 2 that when Jesus went into the temple, that all the people went to him. So that means they left all the other rabbis who were full of jealousy and envy that Jesus was getting all the attention. And then suddenly the leadership, the scribes and Pharisees, interfere in the whole thing, and they have absolutely no respect for Jesus. So without his permission, they just barge into the crowd, force the crowd to stand aside, and they get Jesus' full attention. Because after all, they're the leaders. And they have dragged a woman along who was caught committing adultery, and they throw her there in front of Jesus. And in putting her in full view of everybody, now we have to keep looking at these men as the leaders of Israel. They were the teachers of the law, and it seems as if they have the weight of the law on their side. So you and I are going to do a little bit of Sherlock Holmes on them and see, are they really keeping the law? So first of all, let's look at Proverbs 10:12, which says that hatred provokes disputes, but love covers all offenses. And what these men have done is they have exposed this woman and her sin in front of everybody. So they've destroyed her reputation completely. In the eyes of the people, she's dead. And they want her physically dead as well. Okay, watch the contrast in the way Jesus deals with them, the accusers, and also the way that Jesus deals with the woman. So you've got to listen very carefully in this, because this is a trial. And Jesus is put in the position of a judge. And the woman is the accused. And the leaders, the men, are the accusers. And the crowds that have gathered around Jesus, they are the jury. Everybody is involved. Everybody wants to know how Jesus would behave in a situation like this. So, listen carefully to what the men said. "Master," they said, "this woman was caught in the very act of committing adultery." Where were they? Surely an act of adultery is committed in a private house, in a private bedroom. If that was so, and they caught her in the very act of committing adultery, then they have plotted her downfall. This was a trap. And the scholars admit that this was a trap of a jealous husband who probably just wanted to get rid of her and to get another woman. No love or anything. But it's even worse than that. They're now going to use this woman to trap Jesus. And what John wants you to see is that there are two victims here. One is guilty and one is innocent. And in the context of the whole drama of the gospel, you need to understand that the innocent one is going to give his life for the guilty. Now, just remember the day of Yom Kippur. On that day, they brought 2 goats to the priest. The 2 of them had to be male, they had to be very pure, and so on, because you couldn't offer anything that wasn't completely pure to God. And they chose one of them, they put the sins of the people on that one and sent it back into the desert. And they took the pure and holy one and they sacrificed that for the sins of the people, asking God's forgiveness. So if you know that this mystery is in the background, you will look on this event slightly differently than you might have looked on it before. Some people are afraid to comment on this text because they call it the sex text. It's nothing to do with that. Nothing whatever. We're looking at how God deals with sinners. That's how we're looking at it. So we have two victims. And the next thing that the accusers say, because they're the prosecution in the case, they say that Moses has ordered us in the law, that's in the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, that women like this should be condemned to death by stoning. So, in the eyes of the crowds, they are using the weight of the law to underline the fact that this woman should be killed. So they appear to be right. But I told you we have to be Sherlock Holmes. We've got to go back to the law. We've got to find out, what does the law actually say? And this is where a lot of people go wrong when they're reading a text. They won't go to the trouble of going into the background and finding out, what do the scriptures say? Well, I'm going to tell you what Deuteronomy 22:22 says, and Leviticus 20:10, both of them say the same thing. This is exactly what they say. If a man is caught sleeping with another man's wife, both must die, the man who has slept with her and the woman herself. There's nothing about women like this. There's nothing about women caught in adultery. It's that the two of them should die. Now, if you're with me doing your Sherlock Holmes thing, and that you have to find the evidence to kill this woman, if they caught the woman in the act of committing adultery, they have the man. They have both, because it takes two. So where is the man? It means that they've no intention of bringing the man to justice. They're merely going to use this woman to bring Jesus down. And so they are committing great sins. Terrible, grave acts of injustice. Okay. Some of the scholars think that the guilty man is in the lineup of the accusers. But the text doesn't say that, so I won't say it. So the law says both of them should die. So there's no justice here at all. Now, they have said that the lay people don't understand the scriptures, so they can make pronouncement like this, and the lay people listening to them think that the leaders are speaking the truth. But Jesus knows better. He's able to read them like a book. He knows their motivation. He knows exactly what they're about. And so Jesus knows that all of them are complicit in this sin. If all of them are complicit in this sin, that puts a completely different picture on the whole thing. They have no authority whatsoever to condemn her. So they said to Jesus, "What have you to say?" We'll deal with the point I've just made in a moment. And John says they asked him this as a test in order to find something against him. In other words, the leaders give Jesus what is called the Solomon question. The Solomon question is, if you say yes, you're in trouble, and if you say no, you're in trouble. Now, the Synoptic Gospels give us an example of this in dealing with paying taxes to Caesar. But this is the way John shows us. And so if Jesus is going to be able to deal with this and deal with it in truth, then he has to show them who he is. He's wisdom incarnate. The leaders don't know that Jesus is wisdom incarnate. They don't accept who he is at all. He's merely a man from Galilee pretending to be somebody big. And so they've even insulted him by saying, where did he learn how to read? So they're not going to expect any wisdom from him. Why do they do this in public in front of this entire crowd? You see, we've got to question everything. It's because The leaders want to destroy the faith that the people have in Jesus. And they want Jesus to make a mistake. They want them to do something wrong. Okay. In other words, the leadership want to be able to stone this woman to death on the authority of Jesus, and that would destroy his reputation completely. It would destroy his reputation as the friend of tax collectors and sinners. So you have to know that the Romans had taken the right of the death penalty off the Jewish Sanhedrin. They were not allowed to kill anybody. But of course you will find in the Acts of the Apostles chapter 7 that they lynched Stephen and apparently got away with it. So they would like to stone this person to death on the authority of Jesus so that Jesus will get into trouble with the Romans. So Jesus can neither say yes nor no. If Jesus says no, then they're going to say he's acting against the law. They already have an accusation against him that he's breaking the Sabbath. They'll say he's acting against the law. And so it seems as if they have him trapped. But who can trap God? Who can trap the Lord? So what does Jesus do? He does something very simple but very profound. Let me read it for you. They asked him this to simply test him, looking for something to get against him. But Jesus bent down and started writing on the ground with his finger. And as they persisted with their question, he looked up and he said, "If there is any one of you who has not sinned, let him be the first to throw a stone at her." And then he bent down and he wrote on the ground a second time. When they heard this, they went away one by one, beginning with the eldest, until Jesus was left alone with the woman. So let's take it slowly. There's a lot going on. Why does Jesus bend down and write in the ground? There is a particular symbol of God which is like this. Sometimes the thumb is turned inwards. It's like this. And it represents the finger of God's right hand. And that was their symbol of God's authority. When you go back to the book of Exodus, and God worked miracles through Moses, the initial miracles were repeated by the sorcerers and the magicians. They could repeat the thing, but they couldn't reverse it. But when they came to the plague of sores, and even the magicians themselves were covered with the sores, they went to the Pharaoh and they said, "Back off. This is the finger of God. This is the sign that the Almighty is really at work." That's very important. In the Synoptic Gospels, when Jesus is in controversy with the leaders and they are accusing him of being devil-possessed and all the rest of it, he tells them that his exorcisms are the finger of God, the sign of God's authority at work. So here you have the finger of God writing in the dust of the earth. Now, that's actually more important than you think, because if you go back to the creation of man, the name that was given to the man was Adma, which means dust. We say Adam in English. I think it should be called Dusty. Adma, dust. So what you have is the finger of God writing on the conscience of man. And Jesus wrote in the ground the list of their sins. But he didn't allow any of the crowd to see it. He did not expose them in public. They were not going to lose any reputation from what he was writing in the ground, because he only had to rub it with his foot to get rid of it. He was not exposing them. Love covers a multitude of sins. But the finger of God's right hand really was working. Some of the scholars seem to think that Jesus may have written Jeremiah 17:13. "O Lord, O hope of Israel, all who forsake you will be put to shame. Those who turn away from you will be written in the dust, because they have forsaken the Lord, the fountain of living water." That prayer actually fits what John is trying to tell us here. And Jesus has already told them, of course, that if they forsake the fountain of living water, that they leave themselves open to justice because they are rejecting the salvation that God has sent to them. Now, you and I are always reading a translation, and it simply says, he started writing in the ground. But if you read this in the Greek it says that he wrote a record against them. That's different. So when Jesus wrote in the ground, he was actually writing their sins. Hence, when he says to them later, can any of you convict me of sin? It's actually terribly important. Okay. And so they persist in this charade of pretending to be the important ones and having the power and the weight of the law behind them for this particular action. Jesus is totally unmoved by that. And so he writes a second time just to make sure they get the message. And eventually he has been forced to judge because they keep accusing. And they will do that when he's on the cross as well. They will still accuse. And so Jesus stood up and he gave the most incredible judgment. If there is any one of you, that's all the accusers, who has not sinned, cast a stone. So what Jesus does is that he obeys the law that someone should be stoned to death for adultery. But if you're going to obey the law, you must obey it fully. And that is that the law laid down that an adulterer could not accuse an adulterer, and a murderer could not accuse a murderer, and a thief could not accuse a thief, just to give you 3 examples. So when Jesus said, if you have not sinned, what he's saying is that if in the sexual area of your life you have never sinned, you have the authority to kill this person. He was on very safe ground, wasn't he? Isn't that the weakest area of our lives? Isn't that where we fall so frequently? What they wanted was that this woman would be killed on his authority. He said, no, you're the leaders. You can kill her on your authority, but you must obey the law correctly. You must obey the law fully. And so his judgment is absolutely incredible. It would have left them completely stunned. And John says something really wonderful. He says, at this, they walked away one by one in rank from the greatest to the least. It's a wonderful statement of John. John says, all have sinned. And they left in rank from the oldest to the youngest. It's really an incredible thing. There was nobody without sin. And the youngest would have been the most hot-headed and would want to stay there as long as they could. But, you know, when the others were gone, they had to go as well. So the crowds saw that this incredible response of Jesus had all of these accusers walk away. And Jesus deals with these men so delicately that I'm sure you've forgotten the woman. Because in this trial, Jesus concentrates completely on the leaders. Completely. And on the fact that if you are going to use authority, you've got to use it according to God's will. And you've got to use authority according to God's love. Now, what everybody misses in this particular text is that Jesus has allowed every single one of them to go away knowing that they are guilty. He could have condemned them. He could have exposed them in front of the crowds. He could have destroyed their reputation in front of everybody. He doesn't do that. Why? For God so loved the world that he sent his only Son, not to condemn the world, but that through him the world might be saved. Jesus was going to give his life for all of these men whom he loved infinitely. And he wanted all of them to be saved. He didn't want any of them to be destroyed. He belongs to a different world. He belongs to a different level. He belongs to a different kingdom. And if we forget that Jesus was going to die for these men, we've misread this text completely. They're all forgiven. Not one of them repents. And it's only when the men are gone completely that you remember that there's a woman still there. So the trial isn't over. He's got rid of the accusers. The case for the prosecution has been thrown out. But what about the person who has been accused? There isn't any doubt in this text that the woman is guilty. And so, what is he going to do? And you have this most delicate moment. You see the delicacy of Jesus' own life here. You see the purity of his own life. Everybody has been staring at this woman, thrown on the ground there in all her sin. It seems that Jesus waited until now to even look at her. That he seemed to protect her with the delicacy of his love. Jesus was left alone with the woman who remained standing there. He looked up. He was bending towards the ground. And he looked up and he said, "Woman, where are they?" Now, the first thing I want you to notice is that Jesus has addressed this woman with exactly the same word with which he addressed his mother in chapter 2. The holiest of all women. So he's not addressing her as to whether she's holy or unholy. He knows that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, as Paul tells us in Romans 3:23. He knows that. He knows that the men are guilty and the women are guilty and the crowd is guilty and we're all guilty. He knows that. And that he came to give his life for us. But he speaks to her with such respect that he gives her back the dignity that they have robbed from her. He tries to give her back something so that she can begin to live again. He said, "Has no one condemned you?" And she said, "No one, sir." Now, sir is Kyrie, it's Lord. Now that tells you something, that this woman, and listening to all that has gone on, she realizes that this person has got to be the most extraordinary human being she has ever come across. She may not realize he's the Messiah, but she addresses him with respect and reverence. And then verse 11 gives you the most wonderful, wonderful thing. Neither do I condemn you. Jesus didn't come into the world to condemn anybody. And if you go to Matthew chapter 7, he tells us not to condemn anybody. It's not our job. It's not our business. He tells us to love and to forgive and to serve, which is what he did himself. And so he said to her, "Go away and don't sin anymore." Now, the interesting thing is, in this particular text, there appears to be no evidence that the woman actually repented. She may have, but there's no evidence in the text. And there's no evidence in the text that the men actually repented either. So what's John saying? John is saying that whether we accept salvation or reject it, that God loves us infinitely anyway. And that Jesus would give his life for us anyway. It's totally astounding. We do nothing to deserve what God has given to us, nothing whatever. We cannot deserve this love. And so the marvelous thing for me in this text at the beginning of John chapter 8 is that forgiveness, love, grace, mercy, and salvation are given to people who don't deserve it. And that's exactly the position of all human beings. On that day, misera met misericordia. Misery met great mercy. And those of us who have learned any level of wisdom, we run to the Lord with our misery, knowing that we will receive great mercy. So there's a lot for us to learn in this particular text. And the fact that it is put in here, right in the center of this enormous controversy, I think is an act of genius on the part of John. Thank you for listening. Slán agus beannacht dé libh. Goodbye. God bless you.